The storm howled against the tall windows of Arthur Delmont's estate, the wind shrieking like a wounded animal caught in the claws of the mountain. Snow slammed against the glass, 1,000 frozen shards carried by a blizzard that showed no mercy. Arthur stood at the wide pane, a glass of untouched scotch on the table behind him, his eyes fixed on the endless white. The world outside had vanished into a swirl of chaos, yet inside his house the fire crackled warmly, shadows dancing across the stone walls. He should have felt safe, but safety meant little to a man who had long ago shut himself away. Arthur was a man of immense wealth. His empire had been built on shrewd decisions and ruthless instincts. Yet it was not the fortune that weighed on him now, it was the hollowness it left behind. Years had passed since he'd spoken to his family. The laughter of friends had long since faded into memory. He had chosen this mountain, this solitude, believing it would silence the noise of the world. Instead, it amplified the silence within him. As the storm raged, Arthur's eyes caught something that didn't belong in the endless white. At first, he thought it was a trick of the storm's odd shadow. A branch snapped loose and dragged by the wind, but then the shape faltered, staggered, and dropped like a stone into the snow. Arthur leaned forward, his breath fogging the glass. His heart, which had grown so accustomed to its slow, indifferent rhythm, jolted with urgency. Throwing on his heavy coat, he pushed open the oak door. The blizzard swallowed him instantly, icy wind slicing into his skin, the snow thick enough to blur his vision. He trudged forward, boots sinking deep into the drifts, each step a fight against the storm's fury. As he drew closer, the shape revealed itself, a young woman, sprawled in the snow, her body small and limp against the vastness of the storm. Arthur dropped to his knees beside her, brushing the snow from her face. She couldn't have been more than 25. Her lips were tinged blue, her skin ghostly pale, and thin clothes clung to her body, ripped and utterly unsuited for the cold. His chest tightened as he pressed his fingers to her neck. For one dreadful moment, he felt nothing. Then, faintly, a weak flutter of life against his touch. Relief came sharp and fast. "Hey," Arthur's voice cracked with urgency, sounding far and even to him. "Can you hear me?" There was no answer, no movement. He gathered her into his arms, surprised by her fragile weight, and began the long walk back to the house. The wind clawed at him, snow pressing into his face, but he kept moving, each step heavier than the last. Inside, the warmth hit like a wave. He laid her gently on the couch near the fire, wrapping her in thick blankets, his hands trembling as he fumbled for his phone. 911. "What's your emergency?" "This is Arthur Delmont. There's a woman unconscious, hypothermic. I found her outside in the storm. Stay with her, sir. We're sending an ambulance immediately." The operator's voice dissolved into static as Arthur ended the call. He turned back to the girl, watching the shallow rise and fall of her chest, the firelight flickering across her bruised temple and scratched hands. Questions pressed against his mind. Who was she? How had she ended up here, in the middle of nowhere, in a storm that could kill a grown man in minutes? The wail of sirens eventually cut through the roar of the storm. The paramedics burst in, bringing with them the sharp smell of antiseptic and urgency. They moved quickly, checking her vitals, fitting an oxygen mask over her face, and loading her onto a stretcher. "She's stable, but only just," one of them said. "If you hadn't found her, she wouldn't have lasted much longer." Arthur nodded, the weight of the words settling deep into him. He followed them to the door, the wind rushing in as they carried her out into the night. For a moment, he stood there, framed in the cold, watching the red lights vanish into the storm's grip. It was then, as he turned to shut the door, that he saw them faint impressions pressed into the snow, footprints, uneven and scattered, leading away from the spot where he had found her. His breath caught. They weren't hers. These tracks were larger, heavier, belonging to someone else. Arthur lingered at the threshold, staring into the dark woods beyond his estate. The storm, still whispering its secrets. The girl had not come alone. Someone else had been out there. And for the first time in years, Arthur Delmont felt the icy grip of fear settle in his chest. The knock came just after sunrise, sharp and deliberate against the heavy oak of the front door. Arthur Delmont had not slept. He had spent the night in his study, pacing between the window and the fire, replaying the sight of the girl crumpled in the snow, her bruised face, the shallow breaths that had almost stopped. He had convinced himself that the storm had swallowed her mystery whole. but the sound of knuckles against wood told him otherwise. He froze in the silence of his estate, the knock echoing through the halls like a warning. Few ever came to this. Mountain delivery trucks were rare, guests non-existent. He hesitated, hand hovering over the latch, his pulse quickening. When he finally opened the door, the cold rushed in, but it was the sight of two uniformed officers standing against the pale glow of the morning that chilled him more. "Mr. Delmont," one of them asked, his breath puffing wide in the air, "we need to speak with you about last night." Arthur stepped aside without a word, gesturing them into the cavernous foyer. Their boots squeaked against the polished stone floor, leaving trails of melting snow. The house seemed to shrink as the officers stood there, eyes sweeping the grand room, taking in the details of his wealth, his solitude. "You reported finding a woman during the storm," the taller officer said, his tone firm but cautious. Arthur nodded. "She was unconscious, barely alive. The paramedics took her to the hospital." The shorter officer flipped through a notepad. "She's stable now, but she's in bad shape. Hypothermia, multiple bruises, lacerations." "Do you know her?" Arthur shook his head. "No, I've never seen her before. She just appeared outside." The taller man's gaze lingered on Arthur, weighing the truth of his words. "That's the strange part," he said quietly. "A woman doesn't just end up in the middle of a blizzard miles from town. Someone brought her here. Someone left her." Arthur's thoughts snapped back to the footprints, those uneven tracks leading into the woods. He had not mentioned them. Not yet. The shorter officer closed his notebook with a snap. "We need to ask where you were last night. Any visitors? Anyone who might have had access to your property?" Arthur's jaw tightened. "I live alone. No one comes here." His voice was flat, but his mind betrayed him. Stirring with questions he could not answer, the taller officer exchanged a glance with his partner. "We'll need you to come down to the station later to give a formal statement. In the meantime," his eyes flicked to the window, to the still-untouched snow outside. "It would help if you told us everything you noticed." Arthur remained silent. To speak of the footprints now would mean admitting he had stood there, staring at them. To paralyzed by questions, to follow them into the dark, and something inside him whispered that whoever had left them might not be far. The officers left as quickly as they had come, their patrol car carving fresh tracks down the winding road. Arthur shut the door, leaning his weight against it, the echo of their boots still in his ears. The house felt colder now, as though the storm had seeped inside. He poured himself coffee and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the steam curling upward. The questions clawed at him. Who was she running from? Why had she collapsed on his land, of all places? And most of all, why did he feel as though the storm had delivered her to him? Like some cruel gift wrapped in frost and silence, the phone rang, its shrill cry cutting through his thoughts. He snatched it up. "This is Dr. Winters from St. Mary's Hospital," a calm voice said. "You're listed as the point of contact for the woman you brought in." Arthur stiffened. "She's alive." "Alive, yes. Still unconscious, but fighting. She sustained injuries, not just from the cold. Bruises consistent with restraint. Scratches that look defensive. Mr. Delmont, do you have any idea who might have done this?" Arthur's hand clenched around the phone. He glanced at the window again, beyond the snow. The woods stood dark and silent, keeping their secrets. "No," he said slowly, "but I intend to find out." He hung up, the weight of those words pressing on his chest. For years, he had lived in exile from the world, safe within walls of wealth and stone. Now, in less than 24 hours, a stranger had shattered that safety. Arthur rose from the table, walked to the window, and looked out again at the edge of the woods. The storm had softened into silence, the snow glittering in the pale light, but there faintly visible, half buried, were the footprints he had seen before, leading away, leading deeper into the trees. Someone had left her there. Someone had intended for her to die. And that someone might still be watching. The night did not come gently. By dusk the mountain was a prison of silence, the kind that pressed against the skin, until even the smallest sound seemed sharp enough to draw blood. Arthur Delmont sat in his study, the fire burning low, the glass of scotch untouched on the table beside him. He told himself he was imagining the tension in the air, the way the shadows seemed heavier than usual, but deep down, he knew something was wrong. Every time he passed the tall windows, his eyes slid toward the tree line beyond the driveway. The snow glittered faintly beneath the moonlight, the world painted in silver and shadow, and there, just beyond sight, The woods stood thick and still, like a wall of secrets waiting to be breached. That was where the footprints had gone. That was where the storm had swallowed someone whole. Arthur tried to distract himself with old papers, financial records, blueprints of projects abandoned years ago. Yet none of it mattered. Every number blurred, every word slipped away. His mind kept circling back to the girl, lying in a hospital bed somewhere, and to the footprints leading into the blackness of the forest. He told himself he should call the police again, mention what he had seen. But some stubborn pride or maybe fear kept his lips sealed. He wanted to understand it first. He wanted to see with his own eyes. It was just past midnight when the first sound came, a soft crack, like a branch snapping under weight. Arthur froze in his chair, his ears strained against the silence. Then another sound, this one closer. His breath caught in his throat. Someone was out there. He rose slowly, every movement deliberate, his pulse pounding like a drum. Crossing the study, he slid open the drawer of his desk and pulled out a flashlight. Its beam harsh when he clicked it on. With cautious steps, he made his way to the front door, pausing only to slip on his heavy coat. The air outside hit him like knives, crisp and cruel. But it wasn't the cold that made his skin crawl. It was the certainty, absolute and suffocating, that he was not alone. The snow crunched beneath his boots as he stepped onto the porch. The night was so still he could hear his own breath. He swept the flashlight beam across the yard. At first, nothing, just white drifts and the skeletal arms of bare trees reaching upward. Then movement, brief, fleeting, the unmistakable shadow of a figure darting between the trunks at the edge of the forest. Arthur's throat tightened. He called out, his voice rough from disuse. "Who's there?" The woods answered with silence. For a long moment he stood, staring into the dark, his hand trembling on the flashlight. He wanted to step forward, to follow the trail, but the memory of the girl's frozen body flashed through his mind, and with it, the chilling thought that whoever had left her here might be waiting for him too. When he finally retreated inside, locking the door behind him, his heart was still hammering. He pressed his back to the wood, listening, waiting. For an hour, he stayed like that, half expecting another knock, another sound, some confirmation that he hadn't imagined it, but the night gave him nothing more. He returned to the study, poured the scotch he had ignored, and forced it down in one burning swallow. Yet the liquor did not calm him. Instead, it sharpened the edge of his fear. He was a man who had conquered empires, who had stood on stages and dictated the fate of industries. But here, in his fortress of stone, he felt cornered, hunted. At dawn, a phone call shattered what little rest he had managed. Dr. Winters again. She woke for a few minutes, the doctor said, his voice tight, delirious, but she spoke. She kept saying the same thing. "Don't let him find me," over and over. Arthur's grip on the phone widened. Did she say who? No name, just fear. Arthur ended the call and sat motionless, the words circling in his head like vultures. "Don't let him find me." They confirmed what he had already sensed. She hadn't stumbled into the storm by accident. She had been running, and whoever she feared was still close. Later that morning, he forced himself back outside, driven by a grim resolve. The snow was untouched near the driveway, but at the edge of the woods, he saw them again, those same uneven tracks, half buried now, but unmistakable. His flashlight beam from the night before had not lied. Someone had been watching. He knelt in the snow, tracing the outline of the footprints with his eyes, larger than the girl's, heavier. The steps were erratic, as though whoever made them had been in a hurry or drunk with rage. They led deeper into the forest, toward shadows where the sunlight could not reach. Arthur stood, his breath fogging the cold air, and for the first time in years he felt a tremor in his chest that had nothing to do with regret or isolation. It was the raw, primal fear of being caught in something larger than himself. And yet, beneath that fear, another feeling stirred, one he hadn't allowed in a long time. Responsibility. The storm had delivered this mystery to his doorstep. Now it demanded something from him. Arthur had not planned on returning to the hospital. After years of burying himself in solitude, he had grown allergic to places that smelled of bleach and grief, where people moved with rushed purpose, and every corridor echoed with the weight of unspoken stories. Yet by noon, he was in his car, winding down the icy mountain road toward town. The call from Dr. Winters had lodged itself in his mind like a splinter. She spoke. She begged not to be found. He told himself it was curiosity that pulled him. out of his fortress, but deep down, he knew it was something else. He had felt her fear, carried her broken weight in his arms, and it had left a mark he could not scrub clean. The hospital was a gray block of concrete, squatting against the whiteness of the valley. Inside, the heat was artificial, cloying. Arthur's presence drew glances. His tailored coat, his sharp profile, the reputation that clung to his name. People recognized him, though few dared to stare outright. He signed in at the front desk and was led to the third floor, to a room where the blinds were half drawn against the pale light. Elena, that was the name on the chart clipped to the bed. She looked smaller here, swallowed by white sheets. Her dark hair spread across the pillow in tangled strands. Her skin was still pale, but color had returned faintly to her cheeks. An oxygen line trailed across her face, her breath shallow, but steady. Arthur stood at the foot of the bed, feeling the strangeness of being tethered to a stranger by threads of fate and storm. Dr. Winters appeared beside him, a man of middle years with tired eyes. "She's young, mid-20s at most," he said softly. "She'll live, though it'll take time. But she's terrified, Mr. Delmont. Even sedated, she thrashes in her sleep. Whoever she's running from left more scars than just what the cold gave her." Arthur's gaze remained fixed on her bruised temple. Did she say anything else? The doctor hesitated. "Only fragments. Don't let him find me." Once she whispered another word. Sounded like brother, but she was delirious. It might mean nothing. Arthur's chest tightened. He turned the word over in his mind like a shard of glass. Brother. The thought burrowed deep, unsettling, though he did not know why. When the doctor left, Arthur moved closer, drawn by something he couldn't explain. He reached the side of her bed, and for the first time in years, he felt the instinct to reach out, not as a man of wealth, not as a recluse guarding his silence, but as a human being compelled to protect another. Her eyelids fluttered. Slowly, painfully, she opened her eyes. They were hazel flecked with green, wide and glassy, locking onto his face as though she recognized him. A tremor passed through her lips. "You," her voice was cracked, little more than a whisper. "You pulled me from the snow." Arthur leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Yes, you're safe now." Her eyes flicked wildly toward the door, then back to him. Her hand, weak and trembling, clutched at his wrist with surprising force. "Don't let him find me," she breathed, desperation sparking through the weakness. "Please, don't let him." Arthur felt the weight of her plea sink into him, like ice water. She held his gaze for a moment longer, then her strength gave out. Her eyes rolled closed, her body sagging back into the bed. The monitor's steady beeping filled the silence that followed. Arthur remained rooted to the spot, her words echoing in his mind. Whoever he was, Elena believed he was close, too close. And for reasons Arthur could not yet explain, she had placed her hope, her survival in him. Later, as Arthur stepped back into the hallway, he caught sight of the police officers at the nurse's station, speaking in low, clipped tones. One of them glanced his way, recognition flickering. Arthur's stomach tightened. He knew suspicion when he saw it. They weren't just here for Elena, they were here for him. By the time he reached the lobby, the world outside had darkened. Snow still fell, softer now, blanketing the town in silence. He pulled his coat tighter, but it was not the cold that unsettled him. It was the feeling that every step he took was being watched. That Elena's fear had crawled from her lips into his own blood. When he finally returned to his estate, night had fallen. The fire burned low again, shadows stretching long across the walls. As he set down his coat, he froze. The air carried something it should not, an unfamiliar scent, faint but sharp, like wet leather and smoke. Arthur's pulse thudded. He turned, scanning the room. Nothing was disturbed. No broken windows, no open doors. And yet he felt it in his bones. Someone had been here. Someone had crossed the line of his sanctuary. He moved to the window, staring into the woods. The snow at the edge of the trees glittered faintly beneath the moonlight. And there, just for an instant, he thought he saw it. A figure standing among the trunks, watching. Arthur's breath caught. He blinked, and the figure was gone. But Elena's words returned to him, burning now like prophecy. "Don't let him find me." Arthur Delmont had spent years hiding from the world. Now, the world had come to his door, dragging shadows with it, and in the stillness of the night, he realized the storm was far from over. It had only just begun. Arthur Delmont did not sleep that night. He tried closing his eyes by the fire, letting the low flames lick shadows across the walls, but each time his mind began to drift. Elena's cracked whisper clawed him awake. "Don't let him find me." Her words had wrapped themselves around his chest like chains, tugging him toward the edge of something darker than he could yet see. By dawn, the snow had stopped falling. The sky was a cold, steel gray, the kind of color that made the world feel drained of life. Arthur pulled on his boots and heavy coat, grabbed the flashlight he had left on his desk, and stepped outside. His estate stretched quiet and vast around him, but his gaze went immediately to the tree line where he had seen the footprints before. The snow was thick but fresh, and the prints were still there, preserved like secrets waiting to be discovered. Arthur followed them, each step crunching into the silence, his breath fogging in the brittle air. The tracks led into the woods, weaving between bare trunks and frozen underbrush. They were uneven, jagged, as if the person who made them had been dragging something heavy or staggering under a weight no one else could see. He kept walking, deeper and deeper into the trees. The further he went, the less his house was visible, until the estate was just a memory behind him. The woods here felt different, cloaked in a stillness too heavy to be natural. His flashlight cut across the snow, and then he saw it, a small clearing, half hidden beneath leaning branches. In the center, a blackened circle of ash where a fire had recently burned. Around it, remnants, a torn canvas tarp, an empty can of beans, a crushed cigarette pack, and then, half buried in the snow, something metallic caught his eye. He bent down, brushing the powder away, and lifted it into his hand. A wristwatch. Its glass was cracked, the strap frayed, but it still ticked faintly, stubborn against the cold. Arthur turned it over in his hand, frowning. The initials etched into the back sent a jolt through him. His own initials. For a dizzying moment he thought it was his, lost long ago. But no, this was older, tarnished, the kind of watch you didn't buy, you inherited. His pulse quickened. He slipped it into his coat pocket, unease twisting in his gut. Whoever had camped here had not been a stranger, or at least, not entirely. The sound of a twig snapping froze him in place. Arthur's head jerked up. The woods were still, the silence deafening. Slowly, he swept the flashlight across the trees. Nothing, just shadows and frost. But he knew what he had heard. Someone had been there, watching him. He backed out of the clearing, his muscles taut, his ears straining. By the time he reached the edge of his property again, his chest was heaving, though from fear or exertion. He could not tell. Inside, he locked the door and went straight to his study, placing the watch on the desk. He stared at it as if it might breathe. The initials burned into him. The longer he looked, the more his thoughts turned to ghosts he had tried to bury, to a man he had once called Blood, who had vanished from his life years ago under a cloud of scandal and betrayal. Arthur poured himself coffee, but his hands shook so badly the cup rattled against the saucer. He tried to steady himself, tried to convince his mind that he was drawing connections where none existed, but the truth gnawed at him. The girl had not been lost in that storm by chance. She had been left on his land, left where he would find her. And now, someone from his past might be tangled in it. As the day wore on, his phone rang again. Dr. Winter's voice was clipped, uneasy. "She woke briefly this morning," the doctor said. She was frightened, almost hysterical. She asked if she was still at the Delmont house. When we told her she was safe in the hospital, she calmed a little. But she's not speaking freely yet. It's like she's afraid every word will summon whoever she's running from. Arthur's eyes flicked back to the watch. His voice was low when he replied, "Keep her safe, doctor. Don't let anyone near her without my approval." That evening, he sat by the fire, the watch still on the desk, and listened to the sounds of his own house. The wind moaned through the chimney. The wood popped and cracked, but beneath those sounds, he swore he heard it again, a creak, faint as a breath, coming from upstairs. He rose, heart pounding, and climbed the steps. The hallway stretched before him, lined with closed doors. He moved carefully, the floor creaking beneath his boots, until he reached the guest room. The door was ajar, just enough for darkness to spill out. Arthur pushed it open with the edge of his hand. The room was empty, nothing disturbed, no footprints in the dust. And yet the window was unlatched, open just a fraction. Snowflakes drifted inside, melting on the floorboards. He shut it quickly, securing the lock. His reflection stared back at him in the glass. But for an instant, he thought he saw another face layered behind his own, a shadow of familiarity. Blurred but undeniable. He turned away, unsettled. It whispered to the empty hall, "What have you dragged into my life, Elena?" The woods beyond his estate seemed to listen, holding their silence close. And somewhere in that silence, he felt that the storm was not gone. It had simply changed form. Arthur Dalemont had always prided himself on control. Control of numbers. Control of power. Control of the carefully walled-off life he had built on the mountain to keep out the world's chaos. But as the hours bled into night again, he knew control had slipped through his hands like sand. The watch on his desk ticked like a heartbeat that wasn't his, steady and taunting. While Elena's words gnawed at the edges of his thoughts, "Don't let him find me." He poured himself another drink but left it untouched, staring instead into the fire. Flames rose and fell, bending shadows across the stone walls. And with every flicker, he thought of the girl's bruised face. There was a time when he would have dismissed her as another stranger, another problem not his to solve. But something about her desperation, her fear had burned into him. And now the storm that had delivered her seemed to have dragged his past with it. A crash shattered the silence. Arthur's head jerked up. It wasn't the shifting of wood in the fireplace, nor the groan of the house against the wind. This was sharper, closer, the unmistakable shatter of glass. His pulse roared in his ears as he rose. Each step toward the sound deliberate, cautious. The air itself felt different, heavier, as though the house had inhaled something it shouldn't. He found it in the dining room. The window over the long oak table was smashed, shards scattered like ice across the floor. Snow drifted in through the jagged opening, staining the rug in white patches. But worse than the broken glass were the footprints, heavy, booted prints, leading from the window toward the far hall. Arthur's body stiffened. He wasn't imagining things anymore. Someone was inside. He slipped back into the study, pulling open the drawer. His hand closed around the cold steel of a revolver he hadn't touched in years. He checked the chamber with practiced efficiency, the old rhythm of his youth returning as though it had been waiting beneath his skin. Then he heard it. Movement upstairs, slow, deliberate. Whoever had come wasn't in a rush. They were searching. Arthur's grip tightened around the weapon. He crept up the staircase, each step groaning under his weight, his ears straining. The hallway stretched long and dim, the only light spilling from the crack beneath the door of the guest room, the same room where he had found the window unlatched the night before. The door stood open now. He pressed himself to the wall, raised the revolver, and stepped inside the empty dot, but not untouched. The blankets on the bed had been disturbed, the closet door ajar, and on the desk by the window sat something that did not belong. A small photograph, edges frayed, the image warped by time. Arthur stepped closer, his stomach sinking as his eyes focused on the faces in the photo. Two boys, standing shoulder to shoulder. Himself barely 20, ambition in his eyes, and beside him, his brother Daniel. Arthur's hand trembled as he lifted it. He hadn't seen his brother in over a decade. Daniel had vanished after the scandal that nearly brought their empire down, leaving behind whispers of betrayal, debts, and darker rumors that Arthur had buried with money and silence. Everyone believed Daniel was dead, but now, a relic of him sat in Arthur's home, placed there deliberately like a signature. The sound of floorboards creaking in the hall snapped his head up. He spun, revolver raised, but the hall was empty, shadows stretching long and thin. He lunged forward, sweeping the corridor with his aim. But by the time he reached the stairs, the only evidence of intrusion was the whisper of the cold wind through the broken dining room window. Whoever had been there was gone. Arthur descended slowly, his chest tight, the photo still clutched in his free hand. He placed it beside the watch on his desk, the ghost staring back at him. Daniel. The initials on the watch, the shadow in the woods. The realization burned like fire through his veins. This was not random. The girl had not collapsed on his land by chance. She had been left there as bait, a message, a warning. The phone rang, jarring him. He snatched it up, his voice rough. "Mr. Dalemont." Dr. Winter's voice was urgent, panicked. "You need to come to the hospital. Now." The girl Elena. She woke again, and she said a name. Arthur's throat went dry. Whose name? Pause. Then the doctor's voice came like the toll of a bell. She said Daniel. She said he's the one she's running from. Arthur's hand tightened around the phone until the plastic creaked. His brother. The man he had buried in memory was not only alive, he was the storm behind it all. And now Arthur knew the footprints, the watch, the photo. They were not threats. They were promises. He hung up the phone and stood there, staring into the fire. The shadows of the flames danced higher, curling like smoke around old sins. For years he had hidden from his past, thinking silence would save him. But Daniel had returned, and he had brought Eleanor's suffering with him. Arthur lifted the revolver, weighing it in his hand, and whispered into the empty house, "If it's you, brother, then this time, I won't run." The storm outside had ended, but inside, a new one had begun, one that would not rest until blood answered for blood. Arthur drove down the mountain road with a speed he had not allowed himself in years. The world outside was a blur of white and gray, the snowbanks high on either side, the tires hissing on packed ice. His hands were tight on the wheel, the revolver resting on the passenger seat beneath his coat. For the first time since the storm had delivered Eleanor into his life, Arthur was not thinking about retreat or silence. He was thinking about war. St. Mary's Hospital loomed ahead, its windows glowing against the bleak winter morning. Arthur parked, strode through the doors, and followed the nurse who met him at the front desk. His name carried weight here. It always had, but now the weight was different, sharper. He wasn't the untouchable millionaire anymore. He was the man tied to the girl whose name had cracked open the grave of his past. Eleanor was awake when he entered her room. She sat upright, her body fragile, but her eyes burning with something fierce and broken all at once. When she saw him, she flinched not from fear, but from memory. "You know him," she whispered, her voice raw. Arthur moved closer, his chest tight. "Daniel." Her lips trembled around the name. He owns me, or he thinks he does. He found me when I had nothing, promised safety, promised love, but it was lies. He took everything, my freedom, my voice. When I ran, he swore no one could hide me, not even the snow." Her words fell like stones, each one heavier than the last. Arthur felt the weight of them in his bones. He had built his life on control, on erasing mistakes with money and distance. But Daniel's sins, their sins had not stayed buried. "Eleanor," Arthur said carefully, "why here? Why my house?" Her eyes locked onto his. Why was something that might have been pity? "Because he wanted you to find me. He wanted you to know," he said. Her voice faltered, then steadied. "He said he'd finish what you started." Arthur's stomach turned. "What you started?" The words echoed in his skull like a curse. He wanted to demand more, but the door to the room swung open before he could. The police officers entered, faces grim. "Mr. Delmont," one of them said, "we need you to come with us." Arthur's jaw tightened. "Why?" "Because your brother just walked into town." The hospital seemed to tilt beneath him. His chest tightened as though the air had been stolen. "Daniel, alive. Near." Arthur left Eleanor with the officers, her eyes pleading as though she feared he would vanish too. He followed the second pair of police to the station downtown, but his mind was not on procedure or questions. It was on the truth he had avoided for years. The night Daniel had vanished, the betrayal, the money stolen, the lives shattered. Arthur had told himself his brother had drowned in his own ruin. Now he knew Daniel had been biding his time, feeding his hate like fire in the dark dot at the station. They showed Arthur the footage, grainy security cameras. Daniel walking through the snowy streets of town, head down, coat ragged, but eyes sharp. As ever, older now, harder, but unmistakably him. Arthur felt the blood drain from his face. That night, Arthur returned to his estate. He knew Daniel would come, just as surely as he knew the storm would always return to these mountains. He built a fire in the hearth and sat waiting, the revolver heavy in his lap, the watch and the photograph on the table beside him like relics of a past that refused to die. It was near midnight when the door creaked open. No knock, no hesitation. A figure stepped into the glow of the firelight. Daniel. His face was gone, eyes burning with a fevered light, but his smile was sharp, mocking. "Brother," Daniel said, his voice like broken glass. "You always did know how to pick up after me." How does she look? The girl, fragile, beautiful in her fear. She's a gift, a reminder. Arthur rose slowly, revolver steady in his hand. "You left her to die." Daniel laughed, the sound low and dangerous. "No, Arthur, I left her for you, to show you what you made me, to show you that blood runs thicker than the snow." They circled each other like predators. The fire crackled between them, throwing shadows on the stone walls. For the first time in decades, Arthur looked into his brother's eyes and saw not the boy who had once stood at his side, but the man shaped by rage, by betrayal, By the silence Arthur had chosen. You blame me, Arthur said, his voice steady despite the storm in his chest. You always did, but your choices were your own. Daniel's smile faltered, twisting into something darker. My choices, or your knife in my back. You built an empire on my ruin, and now you'll watch me tear down everything you have left. Starting with her, the word snapped something inside Arthur. The revolver rose higher, the weight of it no longer foreign. For years he had hidden from consequence, from responsibility. But now, staring into his brother's firelit eyes, he understood. Some storms only end when you walk into their center. The night exploded with shouts, police bursting through the broken window, the blaze of flashlights cutting through the dark. Daniel lunged, rage and desperation twisting his body like a snake. Arthur fired once, the sound thunderous, echoing through the estate like judgment. When the chaos cleared, Daniel lay on the floor, the firelight flickering across his still face. Arthur stood over him, revolver trembling in his hand, the weight of years pressing down. The officers swarmed, voices shouting orders, but Arthur heard none of it. He stared at his brother, at the end of a storm that had begun long before Elena ever collapsed in the snow, and in that silence, Arthur knew his life had been rewritten not by wealth, not by exile, but by the moment he had chosen to act. Later, when Elena was brought to his home for safety, she stood before the fire, her eyes soft but haunted. You saved me, she whispered. Arthur shook his head slowly, staring into the flames. No, you saved me. You reminded me what it means to fight. The storm outside had quieted, but inside Arthur Delmont, the war was far from over. He had faced his brother, buried his ghosts, but the snow would never be just snow again. It would always remind him of the night he found a stranger. In the white and the night, he finally found himself.